Hey, broken salespeople. So, this episode, we're talking to Eric Steeves about all the ways that we're broken on a managerial level. That's this episode of the Broken Salespeople podcast. Hey, broken salespeople. Welcome to the workshop. My name is Red Staffstrom, and today we're here to help you fix your broken sales skills. So, I'm actually bringing in Eric Steeves, and I was introduced to him through Marcus Kauke's The Inquisitor podcast. Um, I, I'm going to say brilliant, and then you're going to fight against me because you're too humble for that. But I had to Google a bunch of things after that podcast because I felt a little over my head in terms of like Web3 and all of that. Why don't you give people a quick overview of who you are, what you do, and we'll dive much deeper from there.
Cool. So that's exactly how I felt with Marcus, by the way. I was like, oh God, I hope I'm saying this right. But
He's a complete master, like a master's level course in sales and management and all of that.
yeah, he's a living body of knowledge.
Yes.
But so I came to specifically like CRM stuff and RevOps stuff from pretty much 20 straight years of selling you name it, every way something can be sold. It's easier to talk about what I didn't do in sales, which is like I've never sold cars, I've never sold insurance, and I've never sold investment advice. But I've
I've done those, not the insurance technically, but I've done the investment advice in the cars. So yeah, you dodged a bullet.
yeah, but everywhere I went in sales, a lot of the horrible training advice and some of the great training advice came from those places too. And then basically 3 or 4 years ago, I was a field salesperson, like door to door B2B stuff, like convincing people to rip and replace their payment processing. And I had to use Salesforce, and Salesforce was absolutely just the biggest barrier to everything I was trying to do in the field. And I was calling our management and getting on calls with their admin team. And one night they said to me, they said, well, why don't you just be the admin if you think it's so easy? And I said, well, okay. And I went on Trailhead that night, and that turned me on this journey of putting everything under ops. Like I had grown businesses, I had sold stuff, I'd managed salespeople, but I didn't have a sense of ops or rev ops, not in the way that SaaS does it, not in the way that like large distributed B2B does it. And I was so lucky that that person said, why don't you just be the admin? Because it pulled my sales skills into this new context where I could have so much more impact.
So this is something I've been talking about a while, and I want to seek your agreement on it. Is the way I've always looked at CRMs in general is almost like a pair of shoes, where if it's too big, like a Salesforce and Infusionsoft for most organizations, it becomes cumbersome and unusable. And if it's too small, then you actually don't get any data. Is that like kind of what you were experiencing? Is it was just too much of a problem to use?
It's well, so for my personal like that story, the issue really was that they had everything limited down so much that I couldn't see a functional difference between that and writing everything in a notebook like I was already. And in fact, I was just
Mm.
duplicating what I was doing in a notebook in their system of record. And what I think it really speaks to is,
So
yeah, go ahead.
So it was like the permissions that were the problem. Like you as a frontline sales rep didn't you weren't able to see anything on a big enough level to be useful.
Yeah, it was purely a managerial tool. And that's what I would say the dichotomy really is. You do have that too big thing, but I think that it's really, if it's coming top down and if the goal is to enshrine micromanagement, then they will and they'll be able to perfectly do it. But the problem, of course, is that they're just laying out this drudgery over their entire organization. And I actually think that a CRM, I mean, like I might sound like a hippie, but I really do think it can empower, lift people up, all of that. Like I think that's possible when you get it right.
So when I was re-listening this morning, I do woodworking, and the analogy that was popping in my head a lot was a CRM can work almost like a CNC machine, where it can basically cookie cutter print out sales for you, but so many people are just taking one piece of it and using it as a hammer.
Yeah, I mean, I was on a call with this super famous dude that I really respect who was talking about, he said that at the highest enterprise level, what was going on was you were selling an outcome, and then the tech was just how you got to the outcome. And what really perked me up for a second when he was talking about it was he goes, I laid out these like 5 metrics that made what I called a diamond account. And I had a really good sense that when they matched these 5 criteria, that I could get that result of selling this big outcome through our product. He said, and I said to him, well, so did your ops team do anything to scale that out for everyone around you in the organization? Like, did anyone capture that lightning in a bottle or whatever? And the guy was like, no, but like I'm years outside my career with them now, and I'm coming back through. And that's something that their consultants should do and stuff. So for me, that felt like a real validation of how I see all of this. Because when you're seeing someone who's like one of the most successful AEs in the space, and he's basically saying I nailed it down to these like 5 account criteria that I could count on, and that worked best for my clients and for me, you know.
So it's kind of that gap selling mentality where you're selling the outcome rather than just selling the technology.
Yep,
And
exactly.
that's a problem I see in SaaS so often too. It's the idea of SaaS is software as a service. You still sell it as a service. You sell an outcome, you sell a product. It just happens to have tech support behind it.
Yeah, and I think that the thing that's really getting lost is it's still people trying to do your job, which is why I really love the kind of like tool shed vibe, right? Because what this stuff is like what people are trying to put their hands on and earn a living with. And that gets so lost in how all of this stuff is sold and done, because the reality is a community of people is going to have to live with this thing you sold them. And is their life going to be better, or is your life going to be better? And I mean, I think you know the answer most of the time, you
Yeah.
know?
Well, and part of it is who has all the buying power in these scenarios. It's the people who have the buying power are the decision makers, are the upper management, and not the people who are actually using it on a day in, day out basis.
Yeah, and you see that in the way that Salesforce is built. So I don't, first of all, I actually do in earnest really fanboy out about Mark Benioff. I really respect and look up to that person. There are
Yeah.
plenty of things problematic between him and Salesforce on the ground, but that's not news to him or anybody else.
No.
But at the same time, if you think in your Mark Benioff and you've had this insight that like I could do CRM in the cloud,
Yes.
is it Mark Benioff's fault that the way business works is he can't walk around to the sales floor telling them how great this is? They're sitting there doing calls and stuff. He has to sell it to management. And so when they do sell it to management, they're going to have to build it for management. And that's exactly what happened. So Salesforce was built for management. And that's actually one of the core issues with it when you're putting it down to the sales team level, is that very few people that administer, consult, design, whatever Salesforce have any sales knowledge whatsoever.
Yeah. And that's like across the board. And even so many managers don't understand how to manage. That's they're just salespeople who walked in one day and got promoted.
Yep.
And that's a whole mess of itself. Um, let's kind of do the magic wands thing for a minute. Like, if you could change something about the way it's built, um, CRMs overall, as opposed to just Salesforce, I'd say,
Mhm.
what would be the biggest, like, immediate change that you would point to somebody from a RevOps basis?
A central user interface. In other words, the user has a reasonable expectation of where things are going to even be. Like if you think about the average sales user, right? Like their tech stack is like, let's just call it 20 touch points deep. That's pretty common at this. So what's infuriating as a human being experiencing it is we all have a language and a culture and a normalcy to how we go through our day. But then when we're in our tech stack, everything is like these funhouse mirrors, similar but different versions of themselves, made up names for functionalities. There's no cohesion to the experience. And if you could create a scenario where things were intuitive and they really were user friendly, and I think what specifically the magic wand would do, if I could wave it, would be, with the best of intentions, developers and engineers think about what it would be like to the user, but they are computer scientists. So their perception of what the platform's ease of use is different, because this is the person who can look at the matrix waterfalling on the screen and see all the buildings. You're not
Yeah.
that person. So it's like, according to them, it's easy to use and all of that. So what I would give them is a stack that was as easy to use as the average video game. They should really be looking at gaming to solve this, because a gaming interface can be operated by children all over the world that don't speak the language the game is happening in. Why can't your sales tech stack do the same thing?
And even like I was born in the mid 80s. Like even gaming itself has gotten so much more complicated. Like I remember the original Nintendo where it's just the directional pad and the two buttons and that was it. Or like the original Game Boys. Now, I mean, just thinking there's two control sticks, a directional pad, a start, a stop. Like there's probably 15, 20 buttons on any controller, and that can still be intimidating for some people.
Exactly.
But that is so much easier than, like, I'm looking at some of these Salesforce interfaces, and just the stuff on the column is probably a dozen different clickable things.
Yeah. And
It,
it becomes, the challenge becomes, what we're really saying is, you have a series of processes that you need to do for your very livelihood, for your survival, right? Like, primitive hierarchy of needs shit is kicking in here for people with how they interact with this. But then at the same time, the complexity is such that these processes are lost in the tools. And so
Mhm.
what's happening is the tool is dictating the process. And not to be as reductive as that whole thing of like, well, if your only tool is a hammer, then everything's a nail or whatever. But that really is what happens in the case of CRM in particular, is that it's so integral to how you could use it, the user experience, that it dictates the process rather than the process dictating the UI. And that's what, in my opinion, RevOps is there to fix, is from the client, the entire ecosystem of clients, over to the people servicing those clients, that there's just this connectivity and alignment that can come from it. That's what's possible anyway.
Yeah. Well, I'm as you're talking about tools and like different hammer. Like I recently read Ron Swanson's book on like woodworking, and he explained something, and it made such sense to me that everything in a wood shop is usually either a hammer or a chisel. Like if you look at a bandsaw, it's just a bunch of chisels on a band. If you're looking at a table saw, it's just a bunch of chisels in one direction. And we've just found new ways to chisel apart that same piece of wood. Once a lot of people see all the tools but don't understand the simplicity of how they're really put together.
Hmm.
And
And
to your point, like the developers can see everything as a chisel because they've been working at it long enough, but they don't understand how massive it is.
right, or how to interpret it at a human level. And like, so this is where like the trades could really help too, right? Like, how often do tech sales ever rely on the strategies that the trades have used for centuries to teach and to learn, things like apprenticeship and like having a clear path for how to learn how to do something, you know?
Well, well, I think there's a big problem in sales from an apprenticeship standpoint because none of us agree. Like, there's so many different styles of sales, just
Mhm.
B2B versus retail sales. And so many people try to take the retail style sales of always be closing and high pressure and bring it into B2B, and it doesn't work. We can't really do an apprenticeship because there is no standardization across the board.
Yeah.
And
And
that's a huge problem of management too.
yeah, but here's a counterpoint to that. So like, martial arts has exponentially exploded in complexity in the last 20 years. And what's also happened is there's been some serious refinement down to saying like, so there's this, and there's this, and these are kind of like what makes a martial art. And then you see the variants of them playing out, right? So if we were to take that back to sales, what I think you can ultimately split sales down into really is the seller aligned toward the outcome for the client or for the seller and its own organization? You're always either one of those. You can't be both at the same time in some perfect way. It's imperfect, so you're always going to end up on one side or the other. Now, that doesn't mean that you're a doormat for your customer and you're just giving the store away and going out of the business, but there's a way to conduct yourself professionally, to be in integrity, to be in strength, where you're going to give what's needed and you're going to lose what's needed to do the right thing. In other words,
Yeah.
you know you've got a bad sale in front of you, but you're not going to push it through just to save your own ass at end of month, and that's the about you, about them line. That's where you're going to see it come out in a person's career.
So the way I'm imagining this, and just the way I'm picturing it in my head, is almost like a DJ slider, and where each person is. Where if they're on the far left, they're a doormat. If they're on the far right, they're that Glengarry Glen Ross asshole.
Right. And you do
And
need both.
where do they have to be? Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's just a depending on where you need to be on each particular sale, where you have to dial it in for that customer experience to be the right way.
Yeah, and then to tie that back to, you can't give someone like this one framework that says like this is the perfect way to do all sales. But what you can do is give the person the judgment and the criteria to make the best decision you can. And like, I was trained in firefighting, and at a very high level, the way that that profession works is, how good are you at sitting with three horrifying decisions, picking one and acting decisively on it? Okay, like, it's not, oh, you're a hero. It's not, oh, you're a genius. You're not Captain Wow. The real kind of like strength or whatever that comes in that profession is you care deeply about an outcome and you want to help. But as a professional, you're aware of the limitations of the situation and the limitations of your toolkit to affect the outcome. So what that dictates for you is, you may know, I would love nothing more than to, the Hulk style, rip the wall of this house off and save these people. But that house is going to collapse on my team and kill 5 firefighters, and we're not going to save one single person. So I'm going to have my people fall back. And that whole neighborhood's going to sit there and watch that happen and think we're the worst people on earth. But really, we're trying to create a new possibility to save them some other way. But right now, we got to do it this way. And tell me that doesn't smack of B2B sales, when things like, when you get into an organization, you start talking to people and you realize that they have what we call like NGMI levels of problems, like where it's like, oh, damn, things are bad here. You're not going to make it. And you're like,
Oh,
do I
okay,
sell
yeah.
this
That I
person?
was trying to figure out the acronym real, like NGMI. Okay, yeah,
Yep.
now it makes sense.
Right. And so you're sitting there saying to yourself, I woke up today because I needed to sell, let's say, CRM deployments. I'm talking to someone who needs a CRM deployment, but unfortunately, this conversation about the CRM deployment is just a journey of discovering all the reasons that not even a CRM would save these people, because they're so far down the road of like whatever thing is going on over there, right? That starts to get very much into that firefighting territory of like, how do we triage this and do the least harm, you know?
And that kind of goes back into like some of the problems, is because so many salespeople are pushed to get the sale anyway, because they're looking at customer acquisition numbers rather than what's good for the business, and they're
Yep.
willing to force a square peg into a round hole, even though that business won't be there 3 months, 6 months, a year down the road.
Yeah, I call that reverse brand building. And I see it in another big part of sales, which is hiring, because the
Yes.
bringing people into an organization is a sale too. And if we look at what just happened over the last few weeks in SaaS in particular, there was that market backed high of like, jam the headcount up, burn the cash, everything's rah, 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 amazing, bonuses. Then there's a macroeconomic indicator that switches the red light to a green light, the green light to a red light, whatever the case may be. And what do these organizations do? They start immediately firing everyone, right? And this is what cracks me up about that. Not that anything's funny about those human beings getting fired. That's terrible. But this
Yeah.
is the really terrible part. What do you think you sell SaaS products to? It's sales teams, right? So if you're a product for sales teams and you just fired, let's say, 1,500 people, and let's
Mhm.
say that the global community of operators is maybe 30,000 people, somewhere in there, 40,000
Yeah.
people. Okay. Well, you just screwed 1,500 of them. So you just created this vector of 1,500 of the 30,000 that are now mixing in that entire pool of everyone else. Do you think they're telling everyone, hey, when things get better, make sure you buy from these people? No, they're moving on with their career and they're growing and they're getting moving on with their lives, right? And so my whole point is that it's so dumb when they do this thing of like, fire everyone right now, because what are you going to do, A, when the market picks back up? Is it going to
Hmm.
suddenly become easier to hire people once you've destroyed your reputation justifiably? And furthermore, okay, great, you get people to try to sell your product. They're now trying to sell them to a market that's aware that you're kind of a major asshole, you know? So,
Well,
like, what does that do?
and that's kind of why I see like General Electric they've taken the fall that they have is because of Jack Welch and his let's just fire the bottom 10% of all performers
Yep,
every year. Like it doesn't happen in a vacuum, and in resources are not infinite. Like there is only so many good people. Like if resources were totally infinite, yes, you could always find somebody better, but you can't do that. And when people are scared of mass layoffs, it makes the culture horrible. It increases complaints. It puts more pressure on HR. It makes every part of the work miserable.
yep.
And I'm curious about your thoughts on this. So, if you were a manager, how would you be using? Because you said hiring is another sale, which I
Mhm.
totally agree with. I don't see many managers using their CRMs for hiring. Have you ever explored that yourself and thought of a way to actually do that in the best possible way?
So that's a really good point. I've never had my hands on that function. And what I
Hmm.
think is that if you think about building pipeline, especially, and we come back to that concept that you're selling to sellers, if you're selling B2B SaaS solutions in particular,
Yeah.
if you're doing that, then I think that there's probably a lot of wisdom in as you're out there prospecting and you're looking through things and you go, oh, like that's not the role on my team, that one person, but they're cool and I met them.
Yeah.
It'd probably be smart to have a way in your CRM to go, hey, staffing, hey, HR, guess what? There's this really cool person out there. Maybe they're a lead. I don't know. And go from there, right? Because the whole thing is like salespeople are supposed to be out there uncovering problems. Well, if you're
Right.
finding problems in a company, the odds are good people are going to leave. So I
Yeah.
think you're onto something there. Nobody's doing that I'm aware of. There are, of course, like bespoke HR builds of CRM that are for the purpose of like a headhunter doing their outbound or like a recruiter.
Yeah.
But that's not what we're
Yeah.
talking about here. I think you're onto something.
Because that was something when I was in real estate sales, I would talk to people because they're usual in so many cases they're player coaches where they're selling, they're trying to list houses, sell houses, etc. But they're also trying to build a team and they're also trying to coordinate all their vendors, all their contractors, all of their everything else. So I would actually go into their CRM and set things up where, okay, this person is set up as a vendor and they have this strip campaign and this outreach program. And this person is set up as a potential recruit and we set that up as well too. But we're only looking at it from a customer acquisition and we should be looking at it from a customer retention standpoint, but that's almost always an afterthought because it's not as sexy as acquisition.
I think I'm going to shout out, I do this a lot, but I'm going to shout out Winning by Design here because
Mhm.
they were the first people I can think of that drew a bright line between there's something in the SaaS revenue model fundamental about getting your client to year 2 or 3 of being installed. That's just purely from a reptilian mathematical level in your best interest as a business.
100%.
But what's fascinating is it turns out that that actually tends to align with what's the best outcome for your customer. In the absence of some sort of near Ponzi scheme situation where your customer is just burning through cash and not getting a result with your product, which I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but that's an outlier. What generally is happening is if you figured out a way to not only solve a problem, but enhance day to day life for an organization that brought your thing in, then the odds are very good that in year 3, for example, they're doing much better than they were before they met you too, which is one of the things that really appeals to me about this business and that model is the notion of bringing the impact and letting the impact guide everything back through the funnel the other way.
Because I know, like, when I was doing CRM sales and I was doing all that, I knew that we weren't going to make money for probably the first 6 to 8 months at least
Yep.
because of the cost for customer success onboarding, dealing with complaints, dealing with issues. Like, I knew that it was going to take that much time before anything really showed up from a profitability standpoint. But then I look at the way salespeople are compensated, and they're based on the customer acquisition rather than based on the retention.
Absolutely, because that's the number that you're able to take hot off the presses all the way back up to the board. Everything's going crazy. Buy yourself a new boat, take that vacation,
Well,
and that's why.
and that's a big problem in all corporate culture is it's based on the quarter rather than based on long-term financial growth, sustainability. It's why so many SaaS companies aren't profitable, even though they have great annual recurring revenue, monthly recurring revenue, ARR, MRR.
Yep. And that's because most people don't have a macroeconomic awareness of things like the Chicago School of Economics in the 80s and 90s and how that played out in our business culture through things like, in a related way, but not directly, Bain Capital and how they operated. But with the basic idea being that you had people that are getting an MBA being told your sole responsibility, morally, ethically, and activity wise, is to this quarter's profits. And more so than that, you are not the caretaker of an institution. You're the caretaker of 4 quarters or 5 quarters at a company. And on those four
Hmm.
or 5 quarters, you are not ethically or morally restrained from basically stripping the place for parts, not even for your company, for you, stripping down your division for parts, giving yourself all of the value and
Yeah.
piecing out, basically coming in and stealing everything. That
Well,
actually became a management thing that was taught. So if you've got people that are that psychopathic, what do you think they're going to do when they have employees? Like, I mean, we saw what that looks like. Like, we've lived through it.
well, and we're seeing it not just in corporate culture, like, but that's the reason why, supposedly, why Russia's having all the problems they have. The reports that I've seen is they were making bribes to Ukrainians, like Ukrainian anti-democratic pro-Russian forces, but the bribes never happened, and they were basically creating fake entries in their CRM
Yeah.
but pocketing the cash. So they would say, okay, well, here's this group. We funded them. We sent money. We sent this. We sent weapons, whatever. But these FSB middle managers were pocketing the cash. And then Russia invaded, expecting it to be 3 days, and they just didn't have the support they expected. That's at
Yeah.
least the rumor that I've heard. We'll never get verification on it, but it's
Yeah. Yeah.
something I tend to believe.
It's in the absence of clear-eyed cynicism that can happen. Like, there's a level of hyper cynicism where you become blinded by your own cynicism, and I think
Yeah.
that's where the Russian mindset, at least as it pertains to their government, that's where they're at right now. But what I think about is that none of this stuff is new. We always
Yeah.
think like, oh, what are we doing? What are we seeing right now? I can't process this. And I think that where I really had an insight about that was if you read No Country for Old Men, not just watch the movie, but in the book of No Country for Old Men, what is really going on is it's the story of the conflict between fathers and sons. But more specifically than that, it's about the fact that what you're seeing where you say like, oh, crime's never been this bad, or violence has never been this bad, or people have never been this greedy, you're mistaken. Like,
Oh,
it's
100%.
something that's just part of the human experience on this planet. And if you can avoid having to wrestle problematically with the belief that, oh, this is just this unique thing that's so woe is me and woe is us right now. And if you go, no, ever since humans have been on the planet, we do these crazy things, we have these dysfunctions as a group. And that if you can then start to like see things, and that was, tying it back to Marcus dumped out this big concept of the spiral dynamics way of thinking and
Yeah.
like those books. And those really do speak to this in a super sophisticated way that makes it make sense.
That's something I haven't gotten to read those but I have them on like my Audible because I'm playing catch up with a million other things. But I love how you're talking about No Country for Old Men and reading fiction to get a better understanding of the human condition overall.
Hmm.
Like the the thought when you were talking about, oh, none of this is new, everybody hates the new generation, like they age out and become cynical. It reminds me of, and you're roughly my age, Gen X,
Hmm.
like millennial, all of the people who said millennials are ruining everything, and you could go back 100 years and see the exact same things about the generations 100 years ago.
Yep. and
It, it,
and my
it's yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
it's just a cycle. That's all it really is, and it's just blaming the younger generations for change and the resistance to change of human beings as a whole, not just older generations, but nobody is really comfortable with change because they like where they are.
And as a matter of our survival, we're wired to distrust the other, the outsider. And why that matters so much, specifically like for sales, is there's a perception in the culture of like salespeople are dirty, pushy, bad, dishonest, all of these things. And part of why this thing with the Ronin mattered so much to me and my brand and in my journey is that the Ronin were these people that the Japanese society loved to just basically shit on and pretend they didn't exist until their particular little prefecture was under attack from 10 warlords at once. And then they're like, we want every Ronin we've ever seen here right now to help with this. And if you look at sales, right, and what we were just discussing with like the macroeconomic ebb and flow and how sales are always the first to get fired and the first to get big bonuses, they're on that outlier thing. What you're really seeing is that we always have a need to define the nice people in terms of who the nasty people are. And how interesting that the nice people are always us and the nasty people are always this other group that we personally can define who they are. So like with sales, with cold calling, right? Like when I used to do outbound and they would get on the phone and they're like, oh, is this a cold call? It's like, yeah, it's a cold call. It's my job to call you and see if I have something you need. It's like, well, I don't want to talk to you. And it's like, well, then stop. You just hang up the phone and I'll keep calling other people, you know? And like, I would not engage them with the energy to defend what I was doing or have me be ashamed of it at all. And I did not engage in anything adversarial with these people. They're having the day they're having. You don't know what they're going through. They don't know what you're going through. Now, naturally, it'd be nice if they could conduct themselves accordingly. But guess what? No one promised you were owed that when you got on the phone. So don't go in there thinking that like anyone has to treat you a certain kind of way. They're not going to.
And I see that as a problem overall with sales. Is we in sales we know that all decisions are emotional, all customers are emotional, but we never extend that to ourselves and talk about our own emotions and what we're going through and how we're having a tough time and how like literally SDRs are putting themselves out there 80 to 100 times a day in many cases.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to think about that emotional side effects the same way we think about everything else. Then taking it back to the CRM, what's the emotional side effect of forcing them to do something that's going to be used to brutally beat them later on?
Yep. They become like a prisoner with the hash marks on the wall of the cell. That's the CRM. Like in
Yeah.
the worst iteration, it's like a feedlot. They're being treated like cattle. And it's
Mhm.
just there to make sure that the ear tag matches the cell and the outcome and all that, which is
Yeah.
dead meat, you know? So like
And it's why so much of our CRM entries are just left voicemail on machine because they're just trying to cover their ass. And there's no real substance within the CRM in so many cases.
yeah, and then there's also the reality that no one ever has the conversation of who does this field benefit? And
Yeah.
everybody laughs at you when you're in the room saying that. When you're like, who does this field benefit? It's like, we're trying to get these like 50 fields done. Like, shut up, we're busy. You're not being productive. Like, that's what it sounds like in the room when you're building CRM and deploying it.
Yeah.
And you say something like, who benefits from this field? And this is like a week ago this happened. Like, the field was something like a tertiary address for a secondary contact for like, and the whole point was like, what in the hell is anyone ever going to do with this? I'm going to die someday. And me, as the guy getting paid more than the people using this thing, what I feel like right now is that this is just a theater of meaninglessness. Like, when am I ever going to mail someone who doesn't even know my contact barely, that's vaguely related? It's asinine. Or
Yeah.
another one would be fax number. Do you understand how many businesses have fucking fax numbers in their
Yeah.
CRMs? Who are you faxing?
Yeah. Like
Okay, and I did fax people
yeah, me too.
in 2011 at a company. I did outbound fax in local B2B, and I actually closed business off of outbound fax blast. But guess what? It didn't do it out of a CRM. And
Yeah.
years later, when I started to see CRMs and they still had the fax field in it, it made me think like, who the hell built this? Was it Don Draper's team at Mad Men? Do they have an ashtray and a thing of bourbon sitting on it? Like, what is going on? You know?
Because faxes have literally been around since the 1800s. Like
Yeah.
you always see that. Like a samurai bringing it back to the Ronin could have technically sent a fax to Abraham Lincoln because like that 1860s timeline all lines up. It's we're so reliant on old technology, and that faxing is something that I was doing very recently. Probably within 4 years ago because I was working in the trucking industry, and so many of them are, so many of them don't even have emails, and they're running a business.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
It's
I
just the
did
field it is.
logistics.
Oh,
So,
my
so
sympathies.
yeah. But what I will say is that I'll run into people in SaaS that will, in earnest, they'll brag. They'll be like, "I know how to use a spreadsheet. Like, I have a spreadsheet as my CRM, and I can then scale that to the CRM." Which, by the way, you should be proud of that because that's like a fundamental skill, but it also could
Yeah,
be a real problem. And you go over to the logistics business, and what you're going to find are these operators that do, like, I'm not kidding you, 300 calls a day, like
yeah.
300. Like, people talk
No,
about
I've
like,
seen
oh,
it.
I do 80 dials a day. It's like, that's cute. In the logistics business, you are going to do like 300 calls a day. I used to get like 1900 emails a day that were like live active conversation, like just, and
Yeah,
like it's on another level. It's interesting how people get so precious about what they do that they think that their personal thing they do is like the pinnacle of difficulty and sophistication. And then you'll look next door at a business that's considered like much less prestigious, and they're doing things on the daily that if they were flexing like that in that other vertical, they'd be way up above majestic in the organization. Like, people going, "Oh my god, come run this place," you know?
yeah. Well, and that's something that I see so often as a problem too. Is like when you're talking about like making more phone calls and everything, like that's almost become the solution for pretty much everything nowadays. Is just let's hit it with more volume. Let's hit it with more volume rather than taking the time and actually evaluating efficiency.
Yep. And you're in a
Like,
hole and they're handing you a shovel and you're standing next to a ladder going, "Hey, I'm just curious about this ladder that people keep climbing down with shovels for me. Why don't
yeah,
we climb the ladder?" You know, and everybody looks at you like you're crazy.
yeah. Like anytime somebody comes in and says like, "Hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. Maybe we should change things a little bit," they're looked at as if they have three heads.
I actually understand why that happens a little more now that I have more responsibility towards like larger outcomes across
Hmm.
populations, which is that like I don't just default to respecting authority, bureaucracy, chain of command. But there is such a thing as like reality and gravity. And if you think
Yes.
about like changing something in an organization, the odds are very good that something obvious that hasn't been changed a long time is the tip of the iceberg of a problem that is so large and so complex that when you hear people being like, "Don't talk about that, like, don't talk about this thing that we need to fix," it's because they've been to like 100 meetings about that other side of the iceberg that you don't even see. And you're like, "Yeah,
Yeah.
I get it. Like, this sucks. But it actually sucks so much more than you even know. And let's all just go cry for a minute and go back to pretending it's not there." You know, like there's that
It's
component of
yeah.
it.
Like I could see it like it's a freeze response. Like when fight, flight, freeze happens, like they see something, they know something has to change, but it's just become such a gargantuan task that they just want to avoid it altogether and just leave it where it is.
Yep. Like I'll give
And
you a great example: fractional RevOps work.
okay,
You aren't going to get hired to do fractional RevOps work somewhere where things are easy, where you could make like you might be able to look at things and say, "Well, if you change this and you change this, then you could get this." And that's great, but how do you empower those people to cause that change to actually happen without making anything worse and profitably? And the short answer is that's why it can be very profitable to do that kind of work, is because it's not easy. And the company is
no,
basically waving a flag saying, "We've had enough, please help."
yeah, and even if they know the thing that needs to change, it's so much many more moving parts than anybody because um the reminder that's coming to me was in Gap Selling, if you've read it.
Mhm.
Keenan talks about building these social media basically for ski instructors. And then they found out that HR couldn't allow that because that would be billable hours, so to speak.
Right,
Like there's always something little, like as simple as it is, if you can solve the problem with a bumper sticker, you're not really solving the problem.
right. But there's
Eh,
a really cool flip side to that, which is
yeah.
look at a guy like Jesse Willett who runs Lead Magic. And
Okay.
when you look at Jesse's story, you see where, and like this is also really discussed in Tech Powered Sales a lot with Justin Michael and Tony Hughes, their book, where what they're talking about is all this stuff we've laid out about what sucks about selling right now and this like loggerhead of the humans banging into their tech. There's a really cool other side of it, which is that the environment on a Darwinian level has raised up specimens like Jesse and like Justin who transcended it. And what they did was they said, this is the outcome I understand that I need. Here's how I'm going to get it one way or another. I know how to cause the tech to do it. And it's not something that I'm going to wait for my company to figure out how to give me. I'm just going to do it. And obviously, like me, those people got fired a lot because of what we just described, because like their very existence shines a light on those big, nasty problems. But what's fascinating is like 1 in every 100 people that talks about the rock we're tripping over every day coming through the lobby
Yep.
is somehow this superhero who's going to kick it with their unobtainium boot and smash it and move on. And like that's who people like Jesse and Justin and lots of other people that I admire are doing, which is like they're coming through and saying like, no, this isn't good enough. And in fact, I do have a better way. And they're also not waiting around for all of the slowpokes to get on the bus with them. They're just too busy kicking ass. And that to me is like the most inspirational thing. It's almost like the Star Wars rebellion playing out, you know?
And as somebody who looks like Chewbacca, I wholeheartedly approve that. um, but and that's one of the great benefits of our modern culture is we're able to see these things change in real time. We're able to see the Galileos of the modern age actually become the heroes that they deserved to be
Yeah,
because the information cycle goes so much faster, and we're able to see them actually become successful, not behaving like they're Don Draper.
right.
Like
Yeah.
that's a huge thing. So, I mean, we've bitched a lot about all of this stuff, but what are you? I want to ask on a positive side of things too.
Uh-huh.
What are some of the things that are most encouraging that you're seeing besides like the Jessies and all of that? Like, what are you most excited about from the sales space currently?
I think that there's a movement to align the skill set of selling and growing a business with
Mhm.
empowering yourself to become an entrepreneur, even if you're not someone's son whose dad went to a country club with your banker. I think that there's a real thing that's happened where people learned how to do agencies from their home remote that just like the cultural perception of like, oh, remote work, like, yes, that's the bottom layer of it, and I'm
Mhm.
not talking down to anyone who's a remote employee. What I'm saying is
No.
that there's another layer that's stacked up on this of potential for self actualization and growth, which is that there were people who said, you know what, I'm actually done being an employee forever.
Yeah.
And with my laptop and my chair, I'm going to solve problems for people. And I'm going to solve those problems so well that I'm going to look around me one day and there's going to be a community of people rooting for me who have helped solve a problem. And I woke up one day and I'm a company. And it's something that's really scary and takes a long time and a ton of work. But to be totally honest, being an employee is almost equally as difficult with less reward. So
Yeah.
I think that that delta between the experience of being an employee and being an operator and an agency level person,
Mhm.
that we're entering a new age, that it does kind of relate to like the tech powered sales TQ thing, which is that an individual operator can have the impact of a large agency economically, and people can make 20, 30 grand a month and not have a boss. And that's what I see coming down. And I'm so stoked to see like some sort of like queer, non-binary, single mom that's of undeterminate ethnicity with her like weird looking family who's a founder CEO, and
Oh yeah.
like that person that the traditional workplace would overlook entirely. There are some leveling things that can happen there that are going to kind of like really screw with the socioeconomic caste system that we have as a result of what's possible working remote and building brands remote. That's what I'm
A-
most excited about.
and that's something. So I saw a post on LinkedIn yesterday where it's a guy who was promoted to like chief revenue officer, and he was a black guy with natural hair, and being able to actually be that. And I remember probably 10 years ago being in sales, me and you have beards. And I remember having numerous people tell me you should shave your beard because it makes people think you're hiding something. Like I remember that advice probably from three different people. I'm like, no, because an orange beard is part of my brand. It's how people remember who I am as opposed to looking like everybody else in a navy blue suit.
Right.
But more to your point, like I think the ability to move from authoritarianism and a corporate culture, being bludgeoned with your CRM, to freedom, like you and I have with our own LLCs, our own businesses, the the ability to slide that over has gotten so much easier over the last 10 years compared to how it was years and years ago because of the internet, because of SaaS tools that being out there.
Hmm.
That escape from micromanaging has become so much better.
And ironically, once you're out here and it's just you delivering everything, selling everything, you wake up one day and realize you're micromanaging you. And it's like
Yes.
you have to make your peace with that. But like the truth is that like being your own boss is a hell of a lot of work. You're doing lots of jobs at once. And I mean, I know that's not news to anybody, but it's
No.
news to anybody that hasn't done it. Let me just say that,
And like the things that come up that you suddenly have to know how to do. Like I would have never expected myself to need to know search engine optimization if you were to ask me 5 years ago.
Yeah.
But now I do have to know it. At least know it enough to hire somebody for it.
You nailed it there. The reality is that you have an obligation to understand what you're hiring people to do for you at a level to at least be fluent in the professional language of what they're doing for you to empower
Yeah.
them to give you what you actually need.
Yeah, because I use like Fiverr, and I have a guy who's absolutely great that I've just started using for search engine optimization work for 10, $15 a video. I need to know what I'm looking at. I still need to understand tags and everything, but I don't need to be the one who actually researches them.
Yep.
And
And
it's so much easier now that I don't need to hire somebody full time or hire an agency. I could find somebody who's doing it anywhere in the world.
yep. And you can really find the thing that's right for you and right for them.
Yeah. And to be able to help people anywhere who are just passionate about the work and creating a good response and having a good relationship, and they have the freedom of not being micromanaged.
Hmm. I mean,
Uh,
I would hope that at a certain point we all find a new relationship to work that's much more like what I saw in Europe, which is like the person that's the butcher really gives a shit about being a great butcher. Like they
yeah.
actually want to be there, like chopping up animals. Like they're great at it.
Hmm.
And like when you go talk to them about like, oh, I want to buy meat from you, person who does this, the kind of quality that you get from a person who sincerely wants to be there. I mean, like we're missing the boat here because we're
100%.
entirely focused on industrial scale. And the truth is that like individual operators bring a level of care that naturally is more competitive in terms of outcome directly to their customer. And I think you're going to see those unit economics playing out in business services.
I think we've assembly lined corporate culture way too much is a big part of it too. Is that butcher is able to work on a bunch of different things, whereas the person who's working on the assembly line of Purdue, he just cuts the wings off.
Yeah.
Like it's the butcher is able to take pride in their work because there's that level of creativity and that level of autonomy to it. Whereas the assembly line worker, and you could carry this over to sales development reps, AEs, account managers, there is no one salesperson in many organizations. You're subdividing sales up even further.
Mhm.
And that's why so many people are unhappy, because they only do the prospecting, they only do the consultation. There's no satisfaction to being able to do the whole job, because you're not building great relationships with people. You don't see things come to full fruition.
And the full fruition is the whole thing. The reason that a person suffers so much in like a highly segmented, like, first of all, the predictable revenue model, like the way Aaron Ross did it, there's real wisdom to it. Okay. Like it makes sense, except that the landscape has gotten a bit more complicated and people have lost sight of some of the ways to do that well. And what I would really say is like, okay, you have an SDR, for example. Are you making them aware of the totality of the deal all the way over to success, all the way over to your customers happy
Hmm.
and telling other people about it? Maybe, but a lot
Yeah.
of the times, no. A lot of the times, all you're being told is like, ask for 27 seconds or some single data point that might be useful to one person, might be totally useless to another. But at the end of the day, you are miles away from a holistic sense of like your worth and your value to the process.
And I see this as a major gap in terms of the sales meetings that we run too, because we've become so segmented. Like, even as an SDR working with other SDRs, I don't get to hear the success stories anymore.
Yep.
Like, I don't get to hear, and stories are, we all know, stories sell, but now I'm only limited to my own experience, and I don't get to hear how we've helped this client out, how we've done this, how we've helped them with that, or what problems we've overcome. And that's just leaving everybody at a disadvantage.
Yes.
And
And it's value. It's
and that is
losing the value prop.
that is one thing that I will say from a remote standpoint, that I think we do miss out on, is being able to have that, somebody walks over and says, "Can I tell you what just happened?" I will
Yeah.
say we do miss that a little bit.
Well, yeah, and I think related to that, what I notice is that the fundamental difference in working remote, and I apologize if it's stating the obvious, but let's say you do have a good team, let's say you do have a good workflow, you have a good culture, and all of that. One of the challenges of being distributed and possibly even asynchronous is you have to engage in emotional labor to get support. So, like, even if you are just pinging a Slack channel, there's an angle where you're basically having to get a micro commit from your team. And even if it is their job, the truth is that you see people doing things the hard way alone, not making the impact that they could as a unit, because there's something about having to say, hey, how do I blank, blank, blank? And so
Yeah.
what I think is really cool is stuff like tools like Scribe, where you're basically able to just say, "Hey, I did this when I solved that problem." Like if you're talking about like deploying CRM, and it's like, "Okay,
Mhm.
this is how I configured this thing." Scribe allows me to have my mentor or my friend or my person who's further ahead on my project click path out what they did in a little PDF where it's just so obvious that I don't then have to bother them in person. Like, so here's the thing, humans need to be shown things lots of times and they need to do them lots of times, right? And
The
unfortunately,
statistic
it's,
I heard is 50, like, we retain 15% of the information we're told, so we need to see things 6 times minimum for in order for us to retain it.
yeah, and related to that, we don't hear what people tell us. One of the
Yeah.
biggest fallacies of the human condition, and it plays into salespeople being broken, definitely, is that let's say the person sitting in front of you listening is actually with the best of intentions trying to hear you. Our brains are such that because we're such anxious scanners of our environment, you're still losing, like, let's call it 30% or more of what the person is telling you on the way in the door. Like your brain
Yeah.
is not necessarily equipped to take in the totality of a person's message, except under very heightened circumstances, which, let's be honest, you're not going to get in a remote sales team. Like that's not
No.
going to happen. So it all comes back to how you can enshrine your processes asynchronously and take away the stigma and the sharing economy component of having to get people to give you micro commits of their time, of their effort, a piece of their day so that you can do your job. That's one of the things we're really struggling with in like distributed teams.
Yeah. Well, but I will also say that, like you're talking about that anxiously scanning your environment, I had that issue significantly working in an open office concept
Oh God,
because it's
yeah.
so easy to get distracted by anything else. And like, I think that's one of the worst things that we've ever done as a corporate society. Like, sure, it looks architecturally great, but we lose the ability to be comfortable in our own space because somebody walks by, somebody makes call, whatever it is, you're just constantly bombarded with new stimulus that you have to interpret while being on the phone.
Yep. I had a coworker tell me, and this will probably resonate with you, but we were a big cubicle farm boiler room kind of thing, big open glass 2-story thing that the second floor looked out over the first floor with all the cubicles and the salespeople. Boss man has a fishbowl office near the door. And as the business development director, whatever that means, I had an office right next to boss man's. My cubicle was right outside his door, right next to the secure front door to the building, right? And I mentioned one time that for me, having like the highest outbound workload, that it was actually quite distracting having all the people coming in and out of the door all day be just right there, right? And
Yeah.
they actually said this to me. Well, our building doesn't have security, and you're kind of a big, scary guy. So we figure we'd rather have you by the front door because you used to be a bouncer. And so like you talk about your like heightened sense of awareness, it's like I
Now you're expecting
already
you to do security too.
yeah. And
Like, you
it's
just
like,
gave you another full-time job.
yeah, and risk, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
please don't make me have to wonder if I'm willing to take a bullet for these people that are actively stabbing me in the back all day at this competitive
Yeah.
organization. Because
Because
I don't want to think about that.
I've had that same experience because I look like, like the it's a joke like Hey Trevor Wilson where he says I look like Duck Dynasty and Game of Thrones had a baby.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Squirrely
So when
Dan.
I was, yeah,
Yeah,
so when I hear that, like, I've had that exact same thing where no, now I'm also have to go and greet potential new hires, and now I have to go and do this, and plus I was the only one who knew how to use so much as a screwdriver in that office, so I was also responsible for maintenance half the time.
yeah.
Like, it's impossible to work in those conditions, and that's why I like remote work, is because I can actually control my environment rather than be given extra job descriptions with a single offhand sentence like you just were.
And to that point, what you get is this talking point comes through where well-intentioned managers, I don't even believe they're like jerks or being creeps about this, but they'll
No.
say like, well, if you're not in the office, you don't get like that hallway talk, like, which we just engaged with that, what I'm describing here.
Yeah.
But here's what they're missing, okay? I used to have to commute for an hour and a half because the office building that I worked in was in a traffic gridlock location that even though it was
Mhm.
geographically 12 miles from my house, the commute could take 20 minutes or it could take an hour and 40 minutes depending on what traffic did. And
Yeah.
when you're trying to sell me this bill of goods that my hallway talk with my coworkers is the thing missing from my career, what I'm going to throw right back to you is, does the dozen hours of high stress, high danger activity sitting in a car weigh that out? Does it really like overcome that? Because then if you factor that in, it's like, no, I'm not leaving my house. I'm going to do it from my
Yeah.
house. I'm not coming to
Yeah.
your cubicle farm to get on Zoom.
Yeah. And all the distractions and the inability to work, but that 5-minute conversation of having a deeper relationship, it's the juice just isn't worth the squeeze.
Yeah, that's a very thin argument in my opinion.
Yeah. And I've heard it over and over again. And yeah, I'm not saying there's not a trade-off, but the trade-off just isn't worth it.
Exactly.
Rather than you step your game up and actually learn how to manage people rather than micromanage them and stare over their shoulder. And that's where we really have that issue, is that's the only way so many people know how to manage is by staring and making sure, well, did you do this?
What
The
it
whole
happens,
office space idea.
yeah, did you fill out your TPS report?
Yeah. And
What
and
we're
that's
really
all it is.
Yeah, it's reductive. And what's sad about it is that you have two potential outcomes with a group of people that you're trying to get to a result. The first one is that the outliers achieve some kind of a result, and then as a group you buy into a story that the people who are not the outlier need to constantly work, beat themselves up, change to be like the outlier, and that's what needs to happen. And in my opinion, that's the most structurally broken thing about sales, is the notion of like everyone needs to try to bash themselves into being the outlier, the top performer. And there's another side to that dumb assumption, which is that that outlier top performer should be disrupted from what awesome thing they're doing to then suddenly be everyone's boss, which is just like the craziest, dumbest thing you could assume. What you need to think about instead is, what could we do to recreate what's good about the outliers process that we can then share with those other people that are not the outlier, that kind of raises the thermostat on their performance. And it didn't require them to beat themselves up or anybody else to get there. And that's the part we really miss. And that's actually why I'm so focused on tech and what it can do for people, is because I think that all other things being equal, your biggest chance to give people that outcome does come from tech.
Oh, 100%. I'll also say that the way things are building, like the biggest broken aspect is we promote people until they suck.
Yeah,
Like if you're a great sales rep, like you'll get promoted to manager, and if you're a great manager, you may get promoted to a regional manager. But if you don't know how to manage managers, you're going to just, they'll promote you until you're a C student. Period.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
the way the entire organization is. We don't let people be superstars at what they're superstars at.
yeah.
So
Most
there's a
places.
it's, yeah, in almost anywhere. I'd probably say at least 80% of any organization with more than a few hundred people.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
probably pretty common. Like easy, it's probably much smaller than that, but just to like a cover your ass thing, I'd say that's an easy barometer. If you've got a few hundred people, you've got a lot of C players.
Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just the nature of it.
It's like in The Wire when Stringer Bell was like yelling at his employees, and he goes, "What you all just brought me is a 40-degree day. Like, you expect me to be excited that it's a 40-degree day outside. You know what I mean? Like what?"
Yeah,
And that's it. Like, you're bringing
yeah.
everyone to the 40-degree day.
And then we're expecting everybody at the bottom to be excited about that same 40-degree day too. Like it's
Yep.
not just people at the top who are upset about it, everybody is upset that it's a 40-degree day, and it's just this big amalgamation of co-misery.
And one place that that's really playing out, and we're starting to get some really valuable insight on, is meeting runtime. And the idea is
Yeah,
that, like, when you're talking to your own team, people default to half-hour blocks for a reason no one can explain. And
yeah.
the truth is that psychologically, the way we're wired, we're much more effective empirically in 15-minute blocks. Or how about no meetings? Like, those work too. um, and then on the other
Oh,
side of it, when I'm talking to a customer or a prospect, this whole movement of like, get the SDR to get a meeting.
mhm.
Yeah, maybe. But let me just counter with, how much impact would the customer get if the SDR's job was to manage, cultivate, and maintain a community of prospects that were talking to each other, that you were building an actual relationship with around a mission. And then on the
Mhm.
other side of that alignment, when they need something, they'll buy it from you. And you don't have to wonder if they'll buy it from you. Like, that's beautiful because you're not wasting
Yeah.
these goddamned half-hour meetings with people that don't want to take them with you anyway. And like, I'm proud to say that I moved my calendar so that I'll only ever book 25 minutes with someone. And I
Mhm.
have a little timer, and at the 23-minute, I start saying to them, I'm sure you need to go to the bathroom or have a drink or something, because I'm so conscientious about wanting this person to like be able to like live their life in that day and not have like 14 back-to-back Zoom calls and like just, turning it into drudgery.
Well, on that note, because like we've done an hour now, and
Yeah.
because I don't want, like, I could tell we can probably still go another hour just bullshitting back and forth. But why don't you tell people how they could get a hold of you, what kind of things you could help them with, like
Yep.
go through the gamut, and then we'll get back to everything too.
So you can find me on LinkedIn. My name is Eric Steeves. My brand name is The Bears Force, and that's my handle on any given social. I do fractional RevOps work. I do advisory stuff kind of behind the scenes. My focus is I have a heavy training in Salesforce. I partner with a Salesforce agency called 21 Knots, where we deploy Salesforce for people. But I also run something called Slack for Sales, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's translating the GTM motion into Slack. And kind of the way that I wireframe it for people is Marconi didn't invent the radio, he invented broadcasting. Radios were everywhere, and Marconi was the first person to go, but if you switch it to all the channels, you can talk to the whole world if you want to. And there's a similar moment in sales with Slack. And the function is basically we're all calling phones that are ringing in empty cubicles or calling cell phones that are blocking them automatically. But what we're not doing is talking to our customers in the Slack channel that they're already in all damn day already. And it's just some of the lowest hanging fruit out there. So what I'm really trying to do is get sales teams on board with, if you're selling B2B especially, much of your sales motion should be happening in Slack, not email. The phone should be there for the human parts of it, but Slack can do things that transcends the phone, and the next few years are going to be fascinating because of it.
And I love that philosophy because I know when I see that little circle, like red circle, like I have to address it almost immediately, as opposed to email where I could be like, ah, that's just spam. And I could almost mark it off almost immediately. So that's a great strategy that if people took nothing else, start implementing that.
Yeah, the cold Slack huddle. You didn't hear it from me, but there are Slack channels with 40 or 50,000 people in them, and you can crack open a cold huddle to all of them at once if you really want to. Use that
Just
superpower sparingly.
yeah, and when you're doing it, don't just walk in and pitch slap and like just put an ad in. Like you actually try to help and say, "Who's having an issue with this? I think I could help."
Yeah, like think about if you did, for example, cybersecurity for agencies and you found out about a vulnerability and you knew that you could help tens of thousands of your peers not suffer because of it. That's a good time to go ahead and have a talk, you know?
Absolutely. But no, Eric, this has been great. Like this was like a super easy conversation, and like again, we probably could go another half hour, but I don't want to take you from everything else. But thank
I
you so much
appreciate you.
for joining me, man.
Thank you, Red. I really appreciate you.
All right. Well, you have a great one, and everybody else, please take the time to like, to subscribe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And until next time, please go fix yourself.